Ready to start your Christian podcast? I've got you covered. Over the last few years, we've launched 7 podcasts that reach 400,000 monthly listeners and get about 5 million downloads a year. This is our step-by-step recipe for launching a Christian podcast that lands with listeners and lasts. Step 1, create a target persona. You probably think your podcast is for everyone, but it's not. Aiming for everyone is a great way to miss everyone. A wise marketer once told me the riches are in the niches, which means the narrower your target is, the more people you'll reach. This is why we create 1 or 2 target personas for every podcast. A persona is a fictional person who demographically matches the sort of person you want to help. Age, gender, education, vocation, family, lifestyle, biblical literacy, theological literacy. Give your persona a name and refer to her frequently throughout the process of creating your podcast. Step 2, brainstorm content. The best way to do this is by creating a Venn diagram. Above the left circle, write format, and then write a list of podcasts that your target persona likely listens to. And then identify patterns. Are they similar lengths, styles, topics, tone? And then on your right circle, write topics, and list out any of the felt needs or interests your target persona is interested in. Not you. Let me repeat that. This is not a podcast for you. It's to help other people. Your target persona is that other person. So make sure that whatever you write there hits their interests, devotions, counseling, prayer, personality, marriage, theology, evangelism, friendship, vocation, culture, whatever interests your target persona, get it over there. And now it's your job to fill in the whole Venn diagram. Make a list in the middle of podcast ideas that fit both the format and the topics your target persona is interested in. Step 3, buy podcasting equipment. There are so many options out there, so let me give you my favorite low-cost, good quality, highly mobile, and easy-to-use podcast setup. First, get a Blue Yeti USB microphone that allows you to record directly onto your laptop. Second, get a pair of Audio-Technica ATH M30Xs. They're over-ear headphones and allow you to hear yourself as you're recording. Trust me, you'll want that. Lastly, grab a pop filter. All in, this runs about $200. If you want a more high-end or middle-end option, click the link to our blog in the notes to see some of our other choices. Step 4, dry run, test, and survey. Do not rush your podcast to publication. First, record 3 sample podcasts. This will help you work out the technical kinks and get used to speaking on a podcast mic, and it will also help you solidify your podcast structure. But most importantly, you can use those test podcasts to solicit listener feedback via surveys. Send the raw audio files of a sample episode to 100 people who approximate your target persona. Ask them to fill out an anonymous Google survey and make sure you get their demographic information as well as their feedback about the podcast itself. Once you get that survey back, take it seriously. If people found it disengaging or said they wouldn't listen, then go back to the brainstorming phase. This has saved me from launching multiple bad podcasts. Do not do a bad podcast. Listen to feedback. Now, if their feedback is more positive, use any of their critiques to hone your podcast, improve your speaking, make the content more useful and engaging for your target persona. Step 5, establish a posting schedule. The single most important thing you can do to keep your listeners engaged is to publish consistently. At a minimum, I recommend posting at least every other week, but every week is even better. Seasonal podcasts aren't a great option because you'll constantly lose listeners between seasons. But the main thing to avoid is random posting. If you post at random times, people will never work your podcast into their regular podcast rotation. So make sure you have a consistent schedule. Step 6, create your podcast name and podcast cover. Now, I gotta say this, don't start here. This is what everybody starts with, but early naming hems you into a single idea before it's fully baked. As you work on naming, keep your target persona in the foreground. If you're aiming for New Yorker readers, go literary. If you're aiming for Midwestern businessmen, go straightforward. If you're aiming for a stay-at-home mom, then go Magnolia Network. You get the idea. The same thing goes for your podcast cover. Make it for your target persona. Remember that your podcast cover image will be viewed on small screens and it will be viewed as a very small icon. For that reason, try to avoid busy images. Make the name as legible as possible. As you do both of these things, it's really important to remember you're not the hero of your podcast. This isn't about you. It's about Jesus and it's about the listener. Position yourself as a wise guide, not the hero. You're Obi-Wan, your listener is Luke Skywalker. So please, please, please don't put your name on your podcast. Instead, evoke the journey of growth you're promising your listener. Step 7, create your podcast intro and outro. Pick music that your target persona would enjoy listening to, and make sure that it fits the overall mood of the podcast. For your intro, stay simple. Introduce your name and the podcast and give a brief, punchy description of what your podcast is or what your podcast does. Your outro should also be very simple. You don't need to restate your name or your podcast name. People already know it. Just thank them for listening and give them one call to action. Don't give them 5 different things to do. And here's what I would recommend. Tell them to share the episode via texting. Texting is the #1 way that episodes get shared. And so that's how you're going to grow your podcast. Tell people to text it out. Step number 8, build a tech stack. You'll need a few pieces of software and tech tools before you launch. For podcast hosting, Lisbon and Podbean are both relatively inexpensive, user-friendly options that allow you to upload your podcast to all major podcast players and track downloads. If you have a larger budget, consider Spotify's hosting service, Megaphone, because it lets you place dynamic content inside a podcast. Okay, let's talk about audio editing. If you don't have any editing experience, you should check out an AI tool called Descript. It is very simple to use and kind of automatically edits your podcast. Otherwise, if you or your editor have some editing experience, Audacity is a great option for you. It is totally free. Logic Pro is probably the best, but you do have to have some resources. Step number 9, record your first 3 episodes and submit them for publication approval. Using your podcast host, submit your podcast and your cover to all of the major podcast hosts for approval. This should definitely include Apple and Spotify at the very least. Apple can take 1 to 6 weeks to approve a podcast, so make sure you give yourself enough time. Once you get it submitted, your podcast is live. And that means it's time to take your next big step. And that's announcing your podcast and getting it out there. I'd love to share more with you about that, but we've run out of time. So if you want to hear more about that and multiple other steps that we couldn't even include on this video with all kinds of examples that you can use, click the link to the blog and get even more than what we have inside of this video. We can disciple the internet together. So get started on that podcast.